Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everybody, both in person and online, to the second workshop organized in the context of the CRASSH research network, Decolonizing Plant Knowledge, Voices from Subaltern Plant Worlds. This one will be dedicated to plant knowledge in plantation economies. I have convened this and also sort of shaped its format and content. I'm Staffan Müllerwille from the HBS department here in Cambridge, one of the co-conveners of this workshop and of this CRASSH research network, alongside Françoise, who's running across the room right now, and Christos and Johanna. My interest in this topic comes sort of from the side. I've worked a lot on Carl Linnaeus, so an old white man in the 18th century who shaped taxonomy in important ways, and who wasn't always old, of course. But in my teaching, I've come across this figure that many of you will be familiar with. Oh, I can't see I have to reorganize here. François Dominique Toussaint Louverture, a successful military leader in the Haitian Revolution. And for me, this figure sort of encapsulates the theme that I wanted to address in this workshop. Toussaint Louverture came from a family of Alada origin, a kingdom in what is now southern Benin. His father was a warrior before being enslaved. So that points out very nicely that slave populations weren't homogeneous. They were ethnically diverse, they were politically diverse, and some of the structures continued from Africa. Toussaint Louverture was often seen as, in this context, as a traditional warrior healer who had received botanical knowledge from forefathers, and that also was an important element of his authority. But on the other side, he was educated by the Jesuits and considered himself scientifically literate, engaged in correspondence and publication of pamphlets, propagated ideas of the French Revolution, especially fraternity, interestingly. And he's been described as someone who had an epic faith in the written word. And one of the first floras of Haiti was produced under his reign, so to speak. So one can see here something which I find very interesting, how sort of on both sides of the divide between the West and the rest, botanical knowledge is considered knowledge that is essential to power, both because plants can kill, but also because they can heal and because they can nourish, of course. It's a kind of royal knowledge, and it becomes, of course, in the 18th century, one of the key aims of European states and also colonizing states to further and promote the knowledge of botany. So the workshop is going to consist of 2 blocks with a little coffee break. So I apologize to our audience. I'll serve coffee to them. We have 2 speakers. I'm going to close my slides in the first bit of the workshop.
Switch. Can you switch the mic to the owl?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I can try to switch the mic to the owl. Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everybody, both in person and online, to the second workshop organized in the context of the CRASSH research network, Decolonizing Plant Knowledge, Voices from Subaltern Plant Worlds. This one will be dedicated to plant knowledge in plantation economies. And I have convened this and also sort of shaped its format and content. I'm Staffan Müllerwille from the HBS department here in Cambridge, one of the co-conveners of this workshop, and of this CRASSH research network alongside Françoise, who's running across the room right now, and Christos and Johanna. My interest in this topic comes sort of from the side. I've worked a lot on Carl Linnaeus, so an old white man in the 18th century who shaped taxonomy in important ways, and who wasn't always old, of course. But in my teaching, I've come across this figure that many of you will be familiar with. Oh, I can't see I have to reorganize here. François Dominique Toussaint Louverture, a successful military leader in the Haitian Revolution. And for me, this figure sort of encapsulates the theme that I wanted to address in this workshop. Toussaint Louverture came from a family of Alada origin, a kingdom in what is now southern Benin. His father was a warrior before being enslaved. So that points out very nicely that slave populations weren't homogeneous. They were ethnically diverse, they were politically diverse, and some of the structures continued from Africa. Toussaint Louverture was often seen as, in this context, as a traditional warrior healer who had received botanical knowledge from forefathers, and that also was an important element of his authority. But on the other side, he was educated by the Jesuits and considered himself scientifically literate, engaged in correspondence and publication of pamphlets, propagated ideas of the French Revolution, especially fraternity, interestingly. And he's been described as someone who had an epic faith in the written word. And one of the first floras of Haiti was produced under his reign, so to speak. So one can see here something which I find very interesting, how sort of on both sides of the divide between the West and the rest, botanical knowledge is considered knowledge that is essential to power, both because plants can kill, but also because they can heal and because they can nourish, of course. It's a kind of royal knowledge, and it becomes, of course, in the 18th century, one of the key aims of European states and also colonizing states to further and promote the knowledge of botany. Let me welcome our first speaker, Christina Welch. Welch, how do you pronounce it?
Either's fine.
Either's fine, Welch. She's joining us from the University of Winchester, where she's a reader in philosophy and theology and religion. She has been researching the Anglo-Caribbean since 2018, especially with a project on the St. Vincent Botanical Garden in the late 18th century, and she's going to present from her research on that.
So thank you, first of all, for inviting me and allowing me to talk about Alexander Anderson, who's a bit of my research passion. Okay, so this paper explores a range of plants used by colonising Europeans, enslaved Africans, and indigenous peoples in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent during the late 18th century that heal, kill, or inebriate. It draws upon two plant catalogues written by Alexander Anderson, the Scottish superintendent of the St. Vincent Botanical Garden, and I'm just going to refer to it as the garden here on. Please note that I'm using direct quotes from the era, and this talk therefore contains terms that today are considered offensive. mandatory thanks slide for the funders which underpin the collaborative project from which this paper's developed. So I thought it might be sensible to geographically situate St Vincent, given the island isn't particularly well known. St Vincent, now St Vincent and the Grenadines, is a windward island country in the Eastern Caribbean Sea, and the garden is situated in the island's capital. Kingstown is in the parish of St George, and as you can see by the names of the parishes, the British colonial influence is literally stamped on the landscape, and the botanical garden was central to colonial efforts. Established in 1765, it's the oldest of its kind in the Western Hemisphere and was created with political aims, with the superintendent tasked with collecting plants and gathering plant information that would add to the body of data available to the British about the practical uses for tropical flora, especially medicinal, commercial, and edible. Anderson was the garden's second superintendent. He took over his role in 1785 and remained shortly before his death in 1811. As well as collecting plants and recording plant uses, Anderson's extant archive consists of personal correspondence, histories of the Caribbean islands he visited, detailed information on the history of St Vincent, and regular lists of plants growing in the garden. These will be drawn on to provide a background to the main focus of the paper, which is, as I said, the examination of plants that in the late 18th century in St Vincent that healed, killed, or inebriated. And apologies in advance, because I am likely to butcher the plant names. Being very dyslexic, floral nomenclature is not a strength of mine. So just putting that out there. So in exploring these plant catalogues, I'll be drawing on only two of Anderson's extant catalogues, and these are the only two that provide information beyond the names of the plants. The 1791 catalogue has information on plant uses only in the medicinal plant section, whereas this 1800s-ish so-called Halter's catalogue provides information on most of the plant species in the garden. This slide shows Anderson's categories and the growth of the garden from when he took it over in 1785 to the last excellent catalogue dated 1806. On the whole, this talk focuses on plant species Anderson listed as medicinal. As you can see in 1785, these together with medicinal and commercial, so the sections in teal and orange, make up approximately 1/3 of the garden. The remaining plants were predominantly useful, so edibles and plants that could be used to make into something, and there were very few he classed as exotics. However, by 1806, exotics make up the bulk of the garden percentage-wise, at just shy at 3/4, with medicinal and medicinal commercial only around 1/8. By this time, 1806, St Vincent was fully colonised and settlers would have had their own gardens for bush medicine. Plus, importation had greatly increased with more merchant ships docking in Kingstown Harbour. Additionally, by 1791, as you can see, Anderson had pretty much decided that the garden would be a nursery, hothousing pretty plants for Kew and the well-to-do back home, such as melastomas. On his plant hunting trip to Guyana in early 1791, he collected a lot of melastomas, a species he classified as exotic, curious, and ornamental. And the bulk of his dried and pressed plant vouchers held at the Natural History Museum in London are indeed melastomas. But none of the melastomas he listed in his catalogue are accepted species today. So whilst he had a passion for them, we're a bit of a loss in regards to contemporary identification. And the need to match up Anderson's plant names with contemporary names is important, as some varieties of melastoma have medicinal properties, but Anderson never recorded a medicinal use for any of them. The first document noting Anderson's collection of curative plants was in his catalogue 24th of March 1791. At this time, the garden comprised 16 acres under cultivation and was worked by 12 enslaved Africans. Little is known about these men, but they slept on site and had their provision grounds on the neighbouring estate. This plan of the garden that forms part of his hortus shows the locations of the huts. You can see that here. And there's an extract from a document that notes that the huts had locks, which we can assume kept them in as opposed to gave them any privacy. We know that the men's labour was hired out by local people with payments to them made every 3 months. I suspect that the same enslaved men stayed working at the garden, though, as he would want to hold on to experienced workers and keep new hires who needed training to a minimum. One enslaved man, we know, had very good horticultural skills and knowledge. He was not hired out to the garden, but purchased by Anderson in January 1790, quote, in trust to and for the public use of the Botanic Garden, and that the labour and service of the said negro be applied under the direction of Alexander Anderson and his successor superintendents of the Botanic Garden to the end, and that Mazarin may be inseparably attached to and comprise part of the public botanic establishment. In 1792, Anderson, in a letter to George Young, Secretary at War, provided an account of the state of the garden, noting that a great loss had been narrowly averted, as Mazarin, quote, a very useful man, had almost died of dysentery. Mazarin's useful work in the garden may have included helping train new workers and possibly even provide some of the knowledge that will inform the rest of this paper. As noted in his 24th of March 1791 plant catalogue, Anderson recorded some basic information about the 52 medicinal plants growing in the garden. The fruit of the 3 capsicum species, Annum, Frutiscum and Baccatum, he noted was much used by blacks and whites, and together with Capsicum grassum stated were, quote, very wholesome in hot climates, good for debilitated reflux and acid digestion, with the ripe fruit pounded into a powder mixed with salt and vinegar, an effective remedy for the putrid sore throat. I've noted a few of the other plants and their cures to provide an overview, and as you can see from here, a few of them, but not all, specify the plant parts used, and cures range from helping with cuts and colds to remedies for ringworm and yaws. Yaws was and remains a terrible disease, and in St. Vincent in Anderson's period could mean bush yaws, which was contracted by sandflies in parts of South America, such as Guyana, and caused ulcers on the arms or legs, or yaws could be the endemic Treponema, a bacterium in the group of bacteria that causes venereal syphilis and is contracted by physical contact. It isn't clear which form of yaws Anderson was referring to, as the indigenous people had connections with South America, whilst the enslaved Africans, even if on the Middle Passage they embarked without yaws, the squalor almost certainly ensured that if they made it to the New World, they were most likely infected. On a plantation, if someone had yaws, then the sufferer was segregated and placed in a yaws hut, typically under the direction of an elderly African enslaved woman who would act as both nurse and doctor. Very few white doctors would venture close to the yaws house due to the fear of catching the disease, which could cause, quote, disgrace and ruin to any respectable white person contracting it. And there's even cases of suicide by someone who accidentally found themselves affected. Although yaws is primarily contracted through touch, insects that lived in the overcrowded yaws houses also passed the disease on. The course of the disease, if there is no secondary infection, can last weeks or months with no suffering, but it's possible for patients to have physical disfigurement and pain for years, with sores on the soles of the feet and palms of the hand. Dr. William Hillary, an English doctor living in Barbados, wrote about the disease in his book on diseases in Barbados in 1766. He noted that, quote, by long observation and experience, the disease can be cured with caustic juices of certain plants when applied externally, and by the juice or decoctions of other plants when taken internally, close quote. He noted that these plants and their uses were kept secret from white folk. A decade later, in 1773, a planter in Grenada wrote about an experiment he'd carried out comparing the European method of treating yaws with mercury, with a traditional African remedy known by elderly enslaved workers. The African recipe involved, quote, giving them decoctions of 2 woods in the country called Bois Royal and Box Fair, and applying an ointment of lime juice and rust of iron to their sores, close quote. This traditional method cured the inflicted within a fortnight, whilst the mercurial treatment did nothing. You can see in this 1801 medical book by Thomas Dancer, the superintendent of the Jamaican Botanical Garden, that there are several remedies for yaws that include lime juice and rust, as well as the prescription cures that included mercury. So thinking about the 1800 set of manuscripts that includes the hortus, we find yaws mentioned a few times. In his medical observations, we find written Gardenia genissa, fruit bruised and fried in an iron pot and applied to yaws cures them, plus a decoction of the roots of Chicosia racemosa cures yaws, with verbena, you can read them, verbena appearing as a cure for yaws and also venereals. Anderson believed that the venereal first originated with yaws and drew on the work of Thomas Trapham, an English physician working in Jamaica, in suggesting that, quote, the origin of yaws was from Indians and Negroes having contact with a species of monkey, close quote. Trapham asserted that the origin of yaws was, quote, a seminal taint monstrously corrupting first the spermatic parts with a cold ingested putridness, branching out oft in the groin and obscene parts, which needed sharp metalline corrosives to cleanse, close quote. But his cure also included the fat of snakes and purging with aloes every full moon. But returning to the slide, we can see that the roots of Paulina senato boiled with lime juice and rust of iron was used to cure yaws, as was a decoction of Solanum bahensis berries. So focusing on plant cures provided to Anderson by indigenous people, at the time known as Caribs, and enslaved Africans, there are three I wish to highlight. Bacconia frantescens, which Anderson collected from indigenous land and helped with ringworm and cataracts. Spilantha salivaria, which he took from the garden of an indigenous person, assisted with toothache. And Piper amalgo. There are two cures listed here, and the first is obstructions. And 9 other plant species are listed as helping with remedy obstructions, but I'm not entirely sure what obstructions meant. As whilst castor oil, fever nut, tamarind, and savarin are abortificants, velvet leaf and monkey's hands were used traditionally in preventing miscarriage. Meanwhile, woevine helps with respiratory issues, agouti vine is a purgative, and Jamaican bitterwood lowers fevers and helps with stomach complaints. As such, there's nothing that would confirm exactly what this strange category of obstructions could be. The other cure associated with Piper amalgo is mal de stomach. The disease was known as Cachia africana, and Anderson lists a couple of cures for it, noting that it was destructive in enslaved Africans newly arrived in the colony. It thus adversely affected plantation profits and was therefore seen as a serious problem. There's a complex and racialized history to mal de stomach, which closely connects to geophagy, the intentional eating of soil and soil-like substances known as pica or dirt eating. Academic writing on the topic suggests it was common in the West Indies, sometimes with iron masts used to break the habit, and you can see that here. Mal de stomach apparently made its victims languid and listless, short-breathed and giddy, and was followed by dropsy, leaving the sufferer unable to work. Some plantation owners believed it to be a form of attempted suicide, and others that it was interference from obeah practitioners. Obeah was practiced in the Anglo-Caribbean and believed by the British to be a form of witchcraft. As well as Piper amalgo, Anderson notes other plants that were effective against mal de stomach. Piper reticulatum was a valuable medicine, particularly in that distinctive disease that mal de stomach in new Negroes. Boiled with lime and rust of iron in a teacupful of the decoction given twice a day cures it in 2 weeks, he says. Whilst the back of Casia excelsior Anderson wrote was, quote, a good remedy for mal de stomach and other obstructions in Negroes. Having explored plants that healed, I now move on to those that had the potential to kill and start with abortificants. The following plants were growing in the garden, but Anderson does not list their abortificant properties. The plant shown here is Poinciana pulcherrima. This is incidentally by John Tiley. Anybody knows about John Tiley? It's one of my favourites of his. Commonly known as Barbados Pride or the peacock flower. It's listed as growing in the garden in 1791 as medicinal, with a note, quote, infusion of the leaves a febrifuge, close quote, and appears in the last of Anderson's plant catalogues in 1806, demonstrating its continued presence. The Useful Tropical Plants website provides the medicinal uses, which includes it being a purgative, an emenog, a remedy for colds and flus. It helps in gum problems, relieves constipation, treats stomach, kidney and bladder issues, and works as a febrifuge and a sudorific. So even though Anderson doesn't note its medicinal purposes, it was clearly very useful. The plant's use as an abortificant has a long history. In 1705, the naturalist Maria Merian recorded how the indigenous and enslaved African women in Suriname, then a Dutch colony, quote, use the seeds to abort their children, close quote. And several websites note that large doses of the root or an infusion of the leaves and seeds are powerful abortificants. Other plants with this property growing in the garden were Mormordica charantia, which appears in the 1791 plant list with information juice and syrup of the fruit, Nephita, which I believe indicated some form of movement. The plant is not listed in the hortus, though, and nor is Gum galbanum, which appeared in the 1773 plant list and is the earliest record of a plant growing in the garden that could be used as an abortificant. Moving on to plants that kill, the best Anderson gives us on that score is plants recorded as poisonous. He has an interesting entry regarding manihot rubia and alba. He notes that, quote, the only discrimination between the two is in the colour, the bitter cassava being the red colour and the other white, but so vague and uncertain is this mark that Negroes are often deceived and use the poisonous kind for the other, and death is generally the consequence, close quote. There are 7 other plants growing in the garden that have the power to kill. Albus praetorius, whose seeds are round and very hard, the size of small pea, scarlet with a black spot. They're frequently used for necklaces. Quantities of them are sent to England, and it is said they are poisonous if given internally. Cissus sequoides, the juice given internally is poisonous, although the Negroes apply the young leaves to sores to heal them, and I have seen their good effects. Daphne occidentalis, the berries are about the size of peas. When ripe, white as snow, the Negroes say the juice is poisonous. Mimosa tortuosa, mimosa, the one that's on there. A decoction of the roots is a strong poison. Sapium, again, you can see, I'm just going to read what's on there. Every part of the plant is complete with a white adhesive juice, which is poisonous. It is used by Indians for catching birds, as birdlime is used in Europe. Eugenia jambos, if eat in any large quantity, they produce a pain in the stomach and are dangerous. The French say a piece of the root is a deadly poison. Arum fotidion, this is a poisonous plant and has a most disagreeable smell, particularly when in flower, like the putrefaction of the human carcass. It taints the atmosphere to a great distance. It is replete with a milky juice of an acrid and poisonous quality. And finally, Serbia thivelia, the plant is replete with a white poisonous juice and has been introduced by Aborigines as the poison of their offensive weapons. When it comes to plants that intoxicate, these largely relate to fishing. Anderson tells us that Galenca toxicana is native to the continent for poisoning rivers and intoxicating the fish in them. I first introduced it into the garden from the habitations. The French bruise the leaves of the Paulinia sinnata and throw them into the rivers to intoxicate fish, and leaves and bark of Pisidia ethrenia are bruised and thrown into rivers, ponds, and intoxicate fish as they lay motionless on the surface of the water and become easy prey. But there are 2 plants that humans used. Passiflora munichi, I can't pronounce it, that's that top one, was a substitute for opium, and the leaves infused in wine and spirits are a strong narcotic. I haven't tried that, but I think it might be kind of fun. Whilst Prunus noyu, when distilled from the fruit or young branches with their leaves and certain properties of brandy or old rum and sugar, is made into the noted noyu by the French and is so great esteemed in the West Indies as well as in Europe, and an endless source of fortunes to the manufacturers. And yeah, quite a lot of people got drunk on noyu wine. So to conclude, a good deal of the information on plant uses that Anderson collected came from indigenous and enslaved African people, and as such, the garden echoes the asymmetry of colonial Caribbean society. There were many plant species he recorded that healed, and a few that had the potential to kill, whilst on the whole, those that intoxicated were used for fishing. St. Vincent, being a small island, late colonised, was on the whole comparatively safe for the British, especially after the mid-1790s when the island's indigenous peoples were exiled, and as such it was largely disease that the colonisers feared, and this is reflected in the medicinal cures noted in Anderson's work. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Thomas C. Anderson. No relations, I guess. No. He's a PhD candidate in the joint program in History of Science and Medicine and Early Modern Studies at Yale. and looks in his PhD at the history of poisons, the environment, and marronage in the Francophone Caribbean. He's joining us. He can be here in person because he's currently working in Paris, of all places. I guess finding loads of stuff that the French would like to keep secret. But anyway, go ahead. You've got your slides up here. Yeah, you should be able to move them. I am trying to let this a little bit convenient for you to reach.
Okay, yeah, that works. Hello. I think we'll find some great through lines between this and the last paper. To be clear, I'm speaking about Guyane, French Guyana, not the same Guyana that we were just talking about. But yeah, so let's just jump in. So somewhere along colonial Guyane's vast network of rivers, swamps, and mangrove thickets, a black fisherman dropped a small packet into the greenish, murky waters. The man then sat back to wait patiently, thus enmeshed in the lush natural landscape of this place. Birds talked to each other and insects swarmed, while a steady breeze whispered through the dense palisade of trees and roots that formed an impenetrable barrier along the riverbanks. All along, the water flowed relentlessly on. After a few minutes' wait, the constancy of these waters, now a muddy brown with the new light that shone down on them, bright and hot, was interrupted by a black mass bubbling up to its surface. Within instants, it was joined by hundreds like it, a field of dead fish now ripe for the hunter's picking, though he only took a dozen or so. The rest he left there, floating dead in the water. In utilizing this fishing method of dropping bundles of the poisonous sinapu and kunani plants into the water, this unnamed maroon simultaneously harnessed ancient knowledge of Guyane's natural world, acquired through cooperation with local indigenous people, yet also stoked nearby French colonists' greatest fear of losing control over nature. So in this talk, I will argue that moments of pronounced colonial instability prompted renewed focus on poison studies in the Francophone Greater Caribbean, as colonists reacted to the increasingly apparent disadvantage that they faced vis-a-vis maroon populations in places like Guyane by attempting to detoxify nature. Poisons were of particular significance in the colonial Caribbean of the 18th and early 19th centuries, as colonists frequently personified their mounting anxieties of armed enslaved rebellion via fears of massive subterranean poison plots among enslaved people aimed at eradicating white existence. As numerous historians, including Chelsea Berry, have explained, the frequency of such concerns rose precipitously in the latter 18th century plantation complex, as events such as the Macandal affair in Haiti, Taki's revolt, or war in Jamaica, the Haitian Revolution, and many related uprisings catalyzed poison panics that would each last for several years following such events until a lack of evidence eventually would cause them to subside. I argue that these moments of poison panic were not isolated events, but they in fact collectively marked the articulation of a sustained colonial effort to employ scientific language to legitimize projects that sought to systematically uproot maroon ecologies and thereby establish colonial dominance. For the purposes of this talk, I will highlight an early 19th century scandal that revolved around the two plants I just described, the sinapu and kunani, that maroons dropped into Guyane's rivers to supposedly poison their waters. By examining contesting claims over this practice and its ecological effects, the supposed dangers it posed to colonial society, and contemporary colonial discourses concerning poisons and maroons, I will lay bare how the foundations of ecological sciences rest on the colonial politics of land ownership and botanical classifications that bear important implications to today. So French colonial administrators largely regarded Guyane as a failed venture until 1763, when they turned to the northeastern shores of South America to recoup the loss of Canada and Louisiana to Britain in the 7 Years' War. The explicit aim of Guyanese redevelopment projects was to create a viable white settler colony and to create a lumber exporting depot to replace Louisiana. And it would in turn become the centerpiece of an efficient and supremely profitable system of extraction between its remaining colonies of Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. Phase 1 of development began disastrously, however, via the royally backed Kourou expedition, which sought to relocate approximately 12,000 Europeans to Guyane en masse. Due to poor planning and the fact that the immigrants arrived in the rainy season, some 9,000 would-be white settlers died on the shores of Guyane from fever, exposure, and starvation between 1763 and 65. The survivors almost unanimously opted to return to Europe on the first ship that would ferry them back. The expedition was a total failure. However, administrators again set their sights on Guyane just a decade later via a project to relocate the colony center from the small island of Cayenne to the Aparoag Basin, which I have argued elsewhere was an explicit attempt to position colonial infrastructure within range to strike at and methodically eradicate maroon ecologies, most notably in the coastal mangroves of the Oyapock Basin. This project ultimately failed to achieve its desired results, partly due to the outbreak of revolution in both France and Haiti, which ushered in several decades of upheaval, culminating in the Portuguese occupation of Guyane from 1809 to 1817. Once the colony returned to French hands under the Bourbon Restoration, Guyane's governors and the Ministry of the Navy and Colonies set their sights on renewing the development projects of the Ancien Regime. While I will focus the remainder of this talk on Guyane under the Restoration, I would be happy to go into further detail about really any of these projects in the Q&A. So Maroons dominated Guyane, and the colony's approximately 400 white inhabitants faced an even greater demographic skew than their peers in other Caribbean locales. The tenuous state of French control was clear to all, such as in the 1762 map by Charles Bouache for the Kourou expedition, which compiled information about Guyane's state of development alongside population and topographical information. And just as a quick PSA, north is at the bottom of the map, so we're kind of upside down. Significantly, Bouache depicted the colony's many failed plantations alongside information about Guyane's abundant maroon and indigenous communities. All of these yellow dots at the bottom of the screen represent failed plantation projects. So the colony was quite literally a wasteland of failed monocultural investment. By contrast, Bouache depicted thriving maroon communities living throughout the colony's hinterlands, including these mountainous communities of several thousand residents each highlighted here. This is just one small sample. While maroon communities dominated the landscape, the simple division of colonial coastline and fugitive Black hinterland that Bouache illustrated here nonetheless undersold colonial fragility. Covert networks and regular Black mobility on Guyane's rivers and through its forests connected the most remote parts of the colony, as one member of the Colonial Council remarked in 1822, quote, "The smallest morsels of news that interest Black people quickly spread throughout the colony. 5 days after news will have been published in Cayenne, it will be known of everywhere," end quote. Putting a finer point on the matter, a prominent planter explained in 1821 that, "Monsieur the Governor, there is no regional commissary or any other authority in Guyane that will prevent enslaved people from marooning into the woods and elsewhere when they please." So even more so than in other Caribbean colonies, it was clear to all in Guyane that Maroons held the upper hand and could do as they pleased, regardless of French desires or actions. Maroons lived in direct opposition to colonial monoculture. Throughout the Caribbean, Maroons relied on constant mobility and inhabitants of hard-to-reach places like mangrove forests, mountains, and thick jungles to thwart and evade colonial hunters. While Maroons wove their lifestyle into the fabric of the natural world in Guyane, philosopher Dinitem Tuambona explains that they came to quote-unquote wear the forests through the constant act of fleeing settler society in lieu of seeking refuge amidst the foliage. Via their intentional enmeshment within nature, therefore, Maroons would come to inhabit a larger-than-life persona, such that the figure of the Maroon became associated with the wild forces of nature themselves in the French colonial psyche by the 1820s, and the power contained within those wild forces. French administrators sought to stymie the inimitable power that Maroons drew from the natural world via land reform, botanico-ecological interventions, and large-scale fugitive slave hunts meant to extract Maroons from their ecological shelters. Land reform efforts made the anthropomorphism of Maroon power explicit, as Simon Montel, an influential colonist living in Cayenne, openly compared Maroons to swarming ants. It is well observed here that those lands which are abandoned shortly after being cleared are soon thereafter filled with hives of activity, or fourmilières, and this is one of the means by which the disproportionately large concessions and the abuse of land clearings compared to the means of cultivators have been so detrimental to the colony. Like ants around a morsel of food, Montel explained disparagingly, maroons could simply appear out of the forest and swarm and subsume any untended spaces. While it is not my intent here to reproduce Montel's racialized description of maroons living in Guyon's forests, it is important to dwell on this description for a moment, insofar as this passage likely grew out of the seed of Montel's awareness of a real agricultural practice among fugitive Black communities. Maroons throughout the Caribbean utilized systems of escape agriculture, such as the Taino-Conuco system, to camouflage and protect crops of essential foodstuffs from outsiders. This type of mixed-use hinterland agriculture could blend seamlessly into an otherwise undisturbed forest, meaning that maroon gardens, enmeshed within the heterogeneity of the forest, would present a stark contrast to geometric colonial plantations predicated on monoculture. One French colonial engineer, Pierre-Marie Sébastien Catino-Laroche, remarked on such practices taking place in Guyane in 1820, quote, "Indigenous peoples in Guyane do not tend their crops. They plant and then nature does the rest. To delve into their fields, which are infested by many harmful plants, explorers had to open up pathways with saber in hand," end quote. It's important here to note that Guyane's indigenous and maroon peoples, while they are distinct groups, share long histories of collaboration and cohabitation, such that today a large group living along the Oyapock River self-identify as Galibi Marono, or in their own terminology, a mixed and united maroon and indigenous people. Therefore, Guyane's maroons learned of many local plants and animals from neighboring indigenous people and regularly cultivated useful plants, including poisons, in plain sight all around the colony. Two such plants became central to French governmental suspicions between 1818 and 1822, sinapu and kunani. As Jean Garrigus has shown in the case of pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue or Haiti, poison accusations were almost always fictions of the colonial imagination. While enslaved and maroon people certainly resisted French power and practices of slavery and also possessed a superior knowledge of nature, colonial hysteria over poison plots promising to extinguish white existence never actually materialized, and mass die-offs were often attributed to disease outbreaks like anthrax, for instance, in the case of Saint-Domingue's livestock in pre-revolutionary Haiti. So poison panics arose especially during periods of upheaval, such as following an uprising, or tellingly in the case of Guyane, after regaining control of a colony from a European rival, the Portuguese. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that on the 3rd of March, 1818, Guyane's post-occupation governor, Claude Carassancière, reinstituted a long-forgotten 18th century ordinance against poisoning rivers, and in so doing, he sparked the latest round of colonial poison hysteria. It has come to pass that men, both master and enslaved alike, his terminology, have come to abuse their rights to freely fish the colony's waters and now hunt in all areas by poisoning the water of our seas, rivers, streams, and marshes, truly all the waterways where they hope to find fish. By these repeated poisonings, they have depopulated these same waters of fish, both large and small. They have imperiled landowners' livestock, and they even imperil mankind. On this last point, we have more than once had the occasion recently to have our suspicions. This disorder has become so common that herbs and plants suited for this bizarre manner of fishing are cultivated on some plantations, are collected from far away, and then are distributed throughout various parts of the colony. To stop the spread of a disorder such as this that has become so widespread, and to stymie these abuses so detrimental to societal order, so harmful to the public good, and so pernicious to the interests of each individual, we hereby pass the following ordinance. So Saint-Cyr ordered that any person caught using or trafficking these poisons be severely punished, with sentences varying based on the accused's race, status as free or enslaved, and their past history of criminal activity. He furthermore ordered that every quarter of the colony be inspected once a year by the regional ordonnateur, a militia member, and up to 2 local guides who knew the area well, so that these commissions could document and then eradicate any sinapu or kunani plants growing in the colony, punish their cultivators, and fine the planters who allowed such practices to take place on their property. Any fines collected would fund rewards for informants who gave the colonial government information about where to find groves of poison cultivation. So taken at face value, the prospect of losing fish and livestock to such a seemingly reckless ecological practice seemed poised to imperil the colony's already fragile economy. Livestock were an especially high value and scarce commodity due to the difficulties of transporting cattle to the colonies and maintaining their populations amidst complicating factors of tropical disease, environment, and climate-based disasters like hurricanes, and the frequent ravages of warfare. Beyond the ecological and economic stakes, such frequent, open, and unflinching uses of poisons also seem to challenge the very tenability of French colonial control of Guyane. After all, with the memory of the Haitian Revolution in the recent past, it seemed only a matter of time before such poisons would be turned against French colonists themselves. And the very presence of poisonous flora ran anathema to the colonial project of controlling the natural environment and regulating its botanical and animal productions. The Colonial Council agreed that swift action was needed and tipped their hand to show just how existential of an issue they deemed Sinapu and Kunani poisoning to be, saying, quote, after discussion, the Council agrees that the second proposed project related to river poisonings is of great significance. Although their actions affect everyone and are difficult to repair, it is highly difficult to find these culprits, given that they can act in mystery. We therefore find that the authors of such crimes must be severely punished. The hunt for the colony's dastardly, secretive, and duplicitous, supposedly river poisoners was on. The only problem for Saint-Cyr and his administrators was that there seemed to be no actual evidence that these river poisonings were inflicting measurable harm on Guyane, its natural resources, or the colony just more generally. Shortly after reintroducing the ordinance against river poisonings, Saint-Cyr received a pointed letter from the Minister of the Marine criticizing how the law punished planters and claiming that it would be impracticable to eradicate the two plants from the entire colony. More pointedly, the short letter demanded an explanation for why such an ordinance had been passed when there was no indication that any livestock had perished or that fish populations were in any peril due to the practice. The royal governor admitted that he himself, so Saint-Cyr, admitted that he himself had not seen or heard of any evidence to support the ordinance in the first place, and that he instead had relied on the word of one planter, a Monsieur Terrasson. In other words, it had taken a single complaint regarding poisons to convince Guyane's colonial administration to enact a large-scale and costly campaign to systematically exterminate all toxic plant matter from the colony. Terrasson, for his part, complained of a colony that appeared to have been left for ruin. Prior to 1789, he claimed Guyane's waterways had been well regulated due to the original ordinance banning river poisonings of 1765, such that any fisherman could easily procure an abundance of fish wherever they looked. Now that poisoning rivers had become an unregulated and common practice, however, fish were supposedly harder to come by. Perhaps even more strikingly, poisonous plants seemed to abound and were actually being cultivated in plain sight. As Terrasson wrote, quote, today one sees on all plantations that the plants used to intoxicate the waters, known by the names Kunani and Sinapu, are publicly cultivated as if they were manioc, end quote. Curiously, while Terrasson groaned that fish had suddenly become a more scarce resource in Guyane, he simultaneously asserted that Guyanese fishers were still able to procure all the fish that they could possibly desire by going to these secretive rivers and inlets farther from the colonially inhabited zones on the coast. This point merits some degree of scrutiny, however, seeing as Maroons and indigenous groups pervaded areas of Guyane that were not active sites of colonial enterprise. What's more, fishing with Sinapu and Kunani originated with Guyane's indigenous communities, who even today continue to use macerated plant matter to distribute pesticide compounds to fish in quantities that are not toxic to humans, compounds like rotenone, for instance. Considering, therefore, that this practice would have far exceeded the limited boundaries of French authority, it is unclear where these supposedly, quote-unquote, uncontaminated waterways that Terrasson mentioned would have been located if they existed at all. In other words, fish populations were almost certainly not in decline in any of Guyane's rivers. It seems that it was perhaps not the threat to fish itself, but instead the prevalence of poisons and the symbolic power that they held that was of true concern to colonists like Terrasson and Saint-Cyr. As time progressed and no evidence arose that populations of cattle or fish were declining due to contaminated waters, Saint-Cyr's ordinance revealed itself to be motivated by a fixation on retaining control of colonial spaces amidst ever-mounting instability. After decades of revolution across the Greater Caribbean, French policies increasingly focused on establishing control over colonial environments by suppressing potential sources of covert poison plots. Amidst this landscape of administrators' fears and planters' anxieties, no sort of quote-unquote hard evidence was required to drive an influential political figure, such as the royal governor of a colony, to enact a sweeping policy that targeted the very substance of colonists' worst fears, poisonous plants. It merely took the suggestion of large-scale poison use, or plots to the same effect, to activate these fears and drive relatively enormous colonial investment into their policing. Even amidst a resounding lack of evidence that Sinapu or Kunani posed any danger, French administrators persisted in reducing their identification of each to an increasingly binarized definition of poisonous and therefore dangerous and needing to be suppressed. They did so despite the fact that indigenous people recognized numerous medicinal applications for each plant, which in any other case not involving colonial Caribbean poisons would likely have kicked off a new round of bioprospecting and study of each plant by European botanists. Such conviction in the face of consistently contrasting evidence elucidates how colonists reacted to an ever-mounting awareness of their own instability after decades of colonial unrest and revolution by attempting to regulate environmental practices, and that controlling poisons was generally the first step they took as part of larger efforts to combat marronage and seize further control over colonial territories. Thank you.
We're going to have 3 short comments now to open up a general discussion among both in-person and online participants. The commentators are Pratik Chakrabarti, very well known for his work on medicine and empire, and more recently geology and empire, and the distant paths. Then we're going to have Pablo Gomez, known for his book, The Experiential Caribbean, and a new book, Bloody Numbers, on Atlantic slave trade and notions of corporality. And then in person, Emily Senior, here from the Faculty of English in Cambridge, who's working on a Caribbean history of the book, which I find very interesting, and also has a project on colonial collections. We're doing one by one in alphabetical order. So Pratik, over to you.
Thank you, Stefan, for inviting me as a commentator. You didn't tell me it will be a short comment. I'm just joking. I will keep it very short. And I thoroughly enjoyed the papers and the discussion and the question answer, and I look forward to more discussions. So I have, I'll make a general point to come to the more specific issues that I can see with these papers, which is fascinating papers. Just bear with me. I'll just have to develop a backdrop to what I'm going to suggest here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Thank you. So what we have, this is a journey of what is known as colonial history of botany, natural history, and sciences. This is the big backdrop of what we have seen in that development. And one of the main approaches that have enabled this new voices, new people to come through into the lenses of history of science, and particularly natural history, has been the development of what is known as social history of science. So science as a social epistemology. And why that has been critical in getting these voices heard, or getting these voices in our register in writing this discipline of history of science and nature, is that the idea that science is produced within a social domain, and it is created and informed by various individuals. It's not an esoteric unfolding of truth, and there are various kinds of voices that contribute to this idea of knowledge. And that has enabled us to widen and understand various voices that are necessary and essential in our understanding of nature. But what we are beginning to see, and these papers highlight that beginning, is they're beginning to see the limits of that social history of science. And what I mean by that limits of the social history of science is that it almost has become an end in itself. The moment we can drop anything to the social domains or various individuals, the purpose of that global history of science is almost served, that others did it as well, kind of syndrome. And that has set the kind of been concomitant with the developments of multiculturalism, epistemological plurality, all those themes that we have developed over the last 20, 30 years with very rigorous research. And we are at the threat of losing that as well. But what I wanted to push towards is that this new moment that we stand, it is becoming obvious that diversity is, or multiculturalism in epistemology, particularly in history of science, has its limits. History of science is different from history of culinary art, or of painting, or of pottery. I can make souffle in my own way. My French neighbor might kill me, but I can call it souffle the way I make it. But natural history is tied to this very important logic of naturalia and historia, that the study of truth lies in the empirical observation of the naturalia, or historia, which is a study of truth, lies in the empirical observation of naturalia. Now, the question then is, does it change that logic of natural history, change if other people are doing it? Or is it the same naturalia historia that is being implicated in various other voices, or we hear the same story through other voices? That is the question we are standing now. And the critical point where we are is how the social translates into the epistemological. That how other people doing science, or enslaved people doing observations of nature, and use of natural remedies, and in terms of environmental and plant body, are changing what we understand as a critical link between naturalia and historia, which is the kind of the old link that has been established. The study of nature is the truth, or empirical observation of nature is truth. And that is the question for me here. So my questions to the individual papers are from that perspective of how the social is influencing the epistemological. We can begin to appreciate the social, but where is the empirical taking place? And to Dr. Welch, my question then is, it's a fascinating study of the various plants, names changing, and what Stefan has talked about, the information overload, and which kind of led to the nomenclature development. But so you have the whole information overload in your literature, and various plants coming in. The botanical garden is a repository of that information overload. The texts are repositories of the information overload. But what we see in these texts and these botanical gardens, when often botanical gardens in colonies become nurseries and not remain botanical garden, because many of the plants are taken away, or the plants of actual knowledge studies are taken away. So my specific question is that how does that translation, on when you're reading these texts, do you see epistemological dropouts in this retranslation or reinscribing of knowledge into the text that you are saying? The hints, it won't be obvious. And it's like subaltern studies, we have to read between the lines. And if to understand subaltern histories of science, that is the precise moment that it's not what is written, but what gets hidden in those transcribing. So what are the moments of loss that you can see in your study of these transcribing of knowledge, the hints? And the hints also already tell us the story that I am pushing towards, the limits of the epistemology, or the limits of the social to the epistemology. Thomas Anderson's paper is fascinating for two reasons, or for one reason, but there are two components to the paper. Now, one component is what I would call, Thomas, and please don't be upset with me, but for my own understanding, is a more conventional history of poisoning or colonial poisoning, where Europeans saw enslaved people or indigenous people in various other parts of the world as they couldn't trust, somebody they couldn't trust, and their poisoning was captured within the world of distrust, and also poisoning was used as resistance to enslavement or to political disenfranchisement. And what you also have with that is the logic of the pharmacon, which is that the same poison could be the antidotes, or poisons could be antidotes to the logic of the poison. So there is an interest in the natural history for that these are not just poisons, but we study them for also antidotes itself, the pharmacon logic. Now, where your paper makes the big breakthrough, and that is where I was fascinated to listen to this, is that you're taking that traditional, conventional idea of colonial history of poisoning to the environmental question of poisoning. Where environmental toxicity or environmental degradation, which is a much later phenomena, and we are not talking about that here, but you already have in the 17th and 18th century this idea of tropics as a disease zone, tropics as torrid zone. So there's an environmental question as well. Now, the point is that the environmental toxicity or environmental poisoning is metaphorical, while the plant-based poisoning of cattle, of fish, of other humans is more biological poisoning. But what you end with is the logic, and that I was fascinated with the logic that you ended with, that the problem for the British was not that the rivers were being poisoned or the fishes were being poisoned. I thought the idea of an intoxicated fish as a new dish is an interesting one. But it's not that they were worried that the fish was being poisoned, but it was that the same logic that poisoning itself was the problem, that it's the poisoning that is the problem. It's not just the environmental poisoning. So my question to you is, where do you see this one, on the one hand, this environmental toxicity that is fish and cattle linking to the larger environmental discourse of the Caribbean and tropical world? And is there a logic of the pharmacon working there, that what is poison can also be regenerative, what is degenerative can also be regenerative? Thank you.
So I think we move on to Pablo.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefan, for the invitation, and Christina and Thomas for two wonderful papers. As Pratik said, I greatly enjoy the conversation, discussion. And so my comments here are going to try to bring together some of the papers, some of the things that I just saw, connecting them, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions and think about the categories that kind of join them and where they're pushing us. I think that Christina's work, similar to Thomas, they're bringing together these histories of, as Pratik was saying, of colonialism, enslavement, botany, extractivism. It intersects with kind of scholarship on the Anthropocene, the plantation scene, and I'm gonna have a couple of comments about that later on, and actually asks us a question, the categories for thinking about these both historical scenarios and developments in ways that that are really provocative. I am particularly interested, Radek, in how the what is behind, or what is kind of the ways in which these categorizations and the organization of botany and plant and natural history, what it allows us to see about both the landscape of colonialism, of extractivism, but also the ways in which we historians have actually organized these sort of knowledges, and what is kind of what lies behind, what are the sort of questions that interest us, and in this is kind of also in conversation with practical questions of what he calls the social, and what are the limits of what he can provide, right? Like, so Christina, your work on Anderson, I think it is right in line with the work of scholars like, that I'm sure you know, like Kathleen Murphy, that just work basically on the work of enslaved people as crucial for the creation of some of the collections in the British Museum. Carolyn Roberts work on the ways in which health practices and the practices of the pharmacopoeia of the 18th century related to the slave trade was created for the specific purposes of the first area of the trade itself. Mary Hicks and Lola Schimberger in highlighting the specific role of enslaved Africans, right, like as crucial actors, right, like both in practices of healing, but also, as you said, and I think this is really important, killing and creating space for inebriation. Right? I think that you're very right in connecting these practices that we somehow seem to have separated, right? Like, and putting them under kind of a same categorization, right? Like, this is true, right? Like from the moment we have records in the 16th, 17th century, we do know that populations of African descent in the Atlantic, and this is something that we tend to forget, right? Like in how is the populations of African descent? They were first. Most of the people living in the Caribbean, these people, they're creating their own spaces of truth, right? Like their own spaces of understanding the world, and this is also crucial, right? Like, and I think this goes back to what we do as historians. What are the sort of things that we're interested in, right? Like, are we interested in a specific set of understandings of what people came to understand of knowledge, or and in this case, Europeans in particular, or the categories are more expansive. And I think that is a big part of those kind of spaces that Prati was referring to. So I've been very interested, right, in thinking about how most of the people living in the Caribbean actually thought about and understood those practices. And the exchanges, and this is something that both Thomas and Christine also refer to, that they have with Amerindian populations. We do know that this is perhaps the most prevalent sort of exchanges of knowledge that happen in the New World. Right, it was actually between people of African descent, in many cases enslaved Africans, and Amerindian communities. And again, we have we know that this was happening even in Atlantic islands like Cape Verde, Madeiras, even before enslaved Africans came to the Americas. So that is another something that there is a lot of continuity here about longer histories, both of understanding and exchanges of the powers of medicinal plants. I was also thinking about the ways in which we understand these gardens, and thinking specifically with Christina, right? Like as spaces for the kind of the promulgation of certain understanding of nature, the creation of taxonomy, but also for the other kind of specialists. And I think that's something that I would like you to hear more about, like the ways in which, if you have had any access to the ways in which we do know that in both in plantations, right, like later on in the 18th and 19th century, but also even in botanical gardens created by the enslaved people themselves, these spaces also function as powerful spiritual communal spaces of the creation for communal power. So I don't know if you have any inklings of that happening in your own kind of records. So again, wonderful papers. And I talking about speaking a little bit about Thomas's paper. I was really fascinated by the ways in which you link this history, these colonial histories, right? Like and the settings in which Maroons are thought of as to this long history of poison, and I think you know very well the work of Chelsea Berry is immediately brought to mind, right? Like the ways in which she's thinking about that category. I think that I really like how you are thinking about poison, right? Like it's a specific moniker, that is the term that you use, right? Like to refer to a set of practices that are more related to the ways in which colonial authorities are thinking about Maroons, rather than that referring to kind of something that is more commensurable or organized around specific epistemologies. and the rifts that you see really between that metropolitan and the colonial spaces. So and so I'm thinking here about how the Maroons, right, like and that we think about like being these actors in the periphery of the real colonies or the real spaces for movement of biota, right? Like especially in the Caribbean, this is true, right? Like actually, we're some of the most successful colonies or inhabitants of both the lands around the Caribbean basin. I'm thinking you're thinking of Guyana, French Guiana, but that is true of all the northern part of South America and all the spaces that in Caribbean islands. We do know of the existence of Maroon ash, right? Like again from the 16th and 17th century in Cuba, in Jamaica, in the Dominican Republic, and they did so with tremendous success. And they some of these spaces survived for generations. In the northern part of the Kingdom of Granada, what today is Colombia, we have spaces that were colonized for decades, similar to what happened in Palmares, right? Like where these groups actually created a very different colonial model, right? Like a very different model for the habitation of the spaces that were not them. They were also migrants that do not depend, as you said, on monoculture, but rather in a different kind of politics, both in terms of ecology, but also in terms of the ways in which they appropriated and incorporated both Amerindian knowledge and the knowledge that they were bringing with them. So thinking about the transportation of not only of quote unquote knowledge and techniques, right? Like, and I'm thinking here of the work of, for instance, Judy Carney, that I'm sure you know very well, right? Like on the movement of African staples and ideas about ideas about the cultivation of rice, among others. But also these plants that we think of as that we categorize as poisonous, right? Like and as I'm sure you also know very well, right, like that there is also this long history of specialists having very deep and detailed knowledge that is empirical in nature. I mean, in some ways, when I'm saying this empirical is not only that they understand and they have the materiality of the work that they have to work with these plants, but also the ways in which they experimented with human populations for, again, the purposes of, and I'm referring back to Christina's paper, the curing, healing, and killing at the same time. So this is a very long history, and I think that what you see in these spaces in Guyana later in the 17th century, it's kind of part of that longer history, and I'm fascinated by how you're thinking about like a different model for thinking about those relationalities and the positionality of both Maroon and enslaved people. This also reminds me of the work of Brican Taboli, who has been working on Dutch Guyana and on those exchanges that were again very common. So finally, I just want to emphasize, right, like that brief that you identified in those ontologies, it always kind of left you with a question about what is the ways in which they themselves there was change over time in the historical conceptualization of these substances, right? Like populations that are outside of European projects for the creation of natural history. But thank you so much. This is wonderful. I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, both of you. That was wonderful. And thank you for those lots of comments as well. There's going to be a lot of questions to think about on them. I suppose my thoughts have been circulating around two topics, one about knowledge production, another about models of ecology. I think I'm going to sort of frame one set of comments towards Tina and one set of comments towards Thomas, but I actually think each question could be slightly expanded and asked of the other one of you. But the first one, Tina, is about kind of textual dynamics of knowledge production and archives and catalogues. Specifically, the catalogue seems to me a fascinating, I'm from the English department, so it's a fascinating kind of set of textual strategies going on in those excerpts that you showed us. So yeah, the production of catalogues and lists of plants and the ways in which those textual productions form a kind of collection in themselves. So they are a collection of specimens in one way. They are a textual manifestation of a collection of specimens. They also function as instituting genres. So I'm thinking of the work of Dahlia Porter here, who talks about the catalogue as a genre which enacts and makes visible the dynamic processes of institution formation and evolution over the time. So she says, what is the procedural rhetoric of the catalogue? What is its role in institution making? How does a list or a catalogue transform a group of material specimens into a paper tool that supports the institution, that encodes also institutional character and values, right? And the institution that is, as we've seen, a kind of very much mixed hybrid space, and you referenced Tiley, and we know that that space is complicated. So yeah, I'm interested in the institutional character of the Botanic Garden and what we can see from the catalogue. It seems to me that the catalogue has a generic imperative to kind of fix and stabilize and order. And then I think what you're showing us is the disruption of some of that order, right? There is this system designed to make specimens knowable as objects, but the kind of system that you showed us in that catalogue is a very complex kind of system, does not seem to be a kind of system that tends towards a narrative march towards order. It's felt to me more like there were kind of continual dislocations and disorders coming out of that catalogue and the different ways in which it manifests different specimens. So I guess my question is, what's the role of the catalogue or indeed other lists of plants in the formation of the garden as the institution, and what kinds of textual strategies does it draw on? And I guess also related to that, actually, what role do Anderson's, I mean, we got a bit of this with the question online, didn't we? But what role do Anderson's catalogues play when we think of them in comparison to different types of catalogues? You told us that he doesn't explicitly do that, but if we compare his catalogues to, for example, yeah, Thomas Dancer does lists from Jamaica, doesn't he? What does that tell us about those practices of inscription? And then I guess, yeah, a sort of question about different types of institutions. So we see the museum coming into play, don't we, later in the 19th century as a kind of idea of a permanent collection. And so I was interested in thinking about the plant catalogue and the Botanic Garden as a different kind of collection. Is it more mobile because of the regularity with which specimens are coming in and out of the Botanic Garden? I don't know. And I guess, yeah, is the catalogue, would you describe it then as a functional space of cultural and formal kind of textual hybridity? Is that one way we might describe it? And kind of tagged on to that, I suppose we talked briefly, didn't we, before you were speaking about kind of digitizing specimens and digitizing catalogues and how to produce metadata for those. And so I'm kind of selfishly interested in ideas about digital catalogues and what our practices might be around that, and how we can digitize this space in a way that will do what Pratik was talking about, bring out different kinds of knowledge systems in those digital forms. And then I mean, like I said, I think that kind of textual, your maps were just amazing, weren't they? Just brilliant. So similar questions could apply about the forms of those maps, I suppose, couldn't they? But I was also thinking about the kind of imaginative models of the water plant relation as it might be thought of in a kind of maroon ecology, because it seemed to me that you painted such an evocative picture of those very complicated swamps and marshes and river routes, and the imbrication of water and land and plants seemed very interesting in Guyana specifically. And I suppose just made me think, yeah, what would a maroon ecology of the river look like, or what would a maroon ecology of kind of water plant relations look like? It looks like the river is a very particular, or the water and the swamp and the marsh are a very particular kind of contested space in Guyana, and so I'm interested in that, with the idea of its relation to plants. And I was trying to kind of mull over water and rivers as, I don't know, are they agents in these acts of poisoning or non-poisoning? How, you know, are they just sort of transporters of toxins to the fish, or actually is what you're saying about the kind of general landscape gesturing towards a more complex idea of what the river is? And I was thinking about those stories from certainly that you hear about in other, I don't know Guyana specifically, but other spaces where rivers and water bodies function as escape routes, don't they? So they both sort of delineate boundaries between plantations in lots of colonial spaces, but they also aid and support fugitive activity and escape. So whether that comes into ideas about water or the river, I was kind of curious to think about. And I suppose the question lingers around your talk, doesn't it? So what extent is it possible to reconstruct anything about maroon knowledge and anything about marine and indigenous models of ecology? Is the river an agent of resistance rather than an empty medium? Is it a kind of flowing source of revolutionary agency? Is that a step too far? I don't know. But to what extent can we map a kind of fugitive spatial imaginary onto what we know about water spaces in Guyana specifically, I suppose? So what might a fugitive ecology, what might a militant ecology, I hear that term used by some people in marine spaces as well, look like in terms of its understanding of spatial relations and water plant relations? Is there, can we talk about a kind of refusal of systems of property, for example, here? Is that one thing that we can identify as part of a maroon ecology in I suppose? And I think those questions should also be positioned in relation to thoughts about the archive and what's possible to glean from those, biased and fragmented and partial collections that we've inherited, and that we look at what's the possibility of historical memory in what Stephen Best has called the anarchival knowledge structure of maroon archive, knowledge that can't enter the archive in some way. And I guess along with that comes thoughts and anxieties too about kind of appropriating for scholarly product, indigenous and maroon ecologies, but nonetheless, I'm really interested to know more about that if there is something to know. But yeah, thank you. I think it's time to let them answer some questions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Tina and Tom, you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, what seemed to me to sort of with the three respondents was to do with the archive. And obviously what I showed in the paper was very much just from 2 plant catalogues, but there's some correspondence that Anderson sent to William Forsyth, who was the King's Gardener in London. There's also material at the Royal Society of Arts in terms of some of the material that he actually sent, physical material objects that he sent over, which are now completely lost. And their sort of records. And then there's the plant catalogues in the National Archive. There's a whole load of receipts in the National Archive. So there's actually not one thing. And it's a really weird set of material that I've actually got, because even stuff at the Linnaean, which is this plant catalogue, a big 1,000-page plant catalogue together with these illustrations by Tiley, it includes Anderson's philosophical thoughts about the deluge in 8 different manuscripts. So there is an awful lot of him philosophizing at that time with science, when the flood was still a reality, but you're sort of heading into Darwinism, even though Darwin wasn't born yet. It's really confusing, and I've still got some of the deluge manuscripts to transcribe. I've still got two of those documents to transcribe. But he talks about the different groups of people in different ways. You're talking about the French Revolution. He hates the French. They killed the king. Don't like the French. He's British, so of course he didn't like the French. Then you've got 2 groups of indigenous people. So you've got the black, what are known as the Black Caribs, which were exiled from St. Vincent in 1797 because they were in cahoots with the French and trying to take the island back. You've then got the yellow or red Caribs, which are now called the Kalinago, who arguably the Garifuna sort of overtook in terms of numbers. Then on top of that, you've got enslaved Africans that were with the French, who sided with the French, enslaved Africans that sided with the British, and then free Africans, all of which he talks about. So I can't actually give you one answer, because he talks about the different types of Caribs in the different ways. He didn't like the black Caribs, partly because they were fighting with the French against the British. So there's all this political stuff that's coming in. So I've got all of this sort of like his reflections on the country, the geology of the country, the geology of Barbados. And on top of all of that, he hated the planters. He absolutely detested plantocracy culture, because he talks about climate change. He doesn't call it climate change, but he actively talks about climate change in Barbados and in St. Vincent. So he's this really weird guy who, I have to say, probably had some sort of neurodivergence. You can tell he only had one child, and that child was born almost a year to the day after he got married. And I definitely, he was obsessive. The amount of documentation I have means he could not have done an awful lot of looking after the enslaved workers. At one stage, he had 21 acres under cultivation and only 18 enslaved workers. So they had over an acre of land each. He wasn't overseeing these people. So they were obviously, and I know from other records that they were taking plants. His wife had an enslaved woman and her 3 children. I've got records that they were playing in the garden, and they had a cat and a dog. And, you know, so it's just this really complicated mess, which I'm in the middle of trying to sort out. So I'd love to be able to give you straight answers, but at the moment, it's just messy. And it doesn't accord to any form of institutional knowledge. So Joseph Banks calls Alexander Anderson a man of practice, not a man of science. So Anderson matriculated his first year at the University of Edinburgh and then hightailed it to New York, left New York with the Revolutionary War, got caught up by the Americans, dumped in eventually St. Lucia when he was trying to get to Suriname. So he's a man that's an everyday man, hasn't got an awful lot of social status, trying to make a name for himself. So there's all these different complexities. And he writes some really nasty stuff about the Caribs. He says that all of the enslaved workers are lazy. And then suddenly you get this thing about Mazarin. So it's very clear he's writing to the people who are paying his wages, towing the party line. But actually, when you start reading through stuff, you sort of think, well, that can't be the case. You can't have thought all the enslaved workers were rubbish at their jobs, because basically you've left them to do their own thing. And they managed to, in 21 years, the garden grew by over 2,000% in terms of plant species. And he instrumented the enslaved way of gardening by using, as Thomas pointed out, this idea about mixed economy, lots of tree cover, to do that. So he was, and he does say, you know, the enslaved, he doesn't use that term obviously, that the enslaved workers were following the footsteps of nature, but he clearly sees that this is productive, and then says the people who own the enslaved workers, their provision grounds are absolutely bare. So there's just this real complex stuff that's going on that I am still trying to get my head around. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions, but I haven't got one archive. Technically, I've got about 8. Because they're all so different and include invoices and letters and random philosophizing about the deluge, which honestly in places is bonkers because he talks about aliens. It's just really complicated. But what I'm trying to do is unpick Anderson as a man and explain how, despite all of his prejudices and the fact he had slaves himself and his wife had enslaved workers, he was listening to indigenous people and he was listening to enslaved Africans and taking that plant knowledge, it secondhand, mediated, he paid them. So goodness only knows if what they said was totally true. You know, we've got to think about their agency as well. And I'm still in the process of trying to unpick all of this. So I don't know if that answers all your questions, but it's just, I have got a mess. That's all I can say. I have got a mess of an archive.
Well, that's always wonderful for a historian.
Well, that's true.
It just takes time to get through it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, thank you for 3 very generous and generative comments. To the question of where does kind of like the environmental history of poison and like the metaphor of poison meet the materiality of poison, think that's a great question. That's what I'm trying to tackle in the full piece, and I'll give a preliminary answer, I suppose. In that, as the language of torrid zone, or a lot of the time in the specifically French sources, they're talking about the miasmatic Antilles, like that specific term. The metaphor is emerging, especially through the era of revolutions, to explain the broad category. When they can't quite, when the colonists, from the colonist perspective, they can't quite pinpoint exactly what is dangerous about these places that the French no longer have control over. And a lot of, that's why I pinpoint, or like underscore a lot of this with the colonial history of like just how much change is happening within the French psyche of the Antilles, just with the huge territorial losses and just shakeups and constant. In one period, Guadeloupe changes hands between the French and British like 6 times in 3 years, so or something like that. So a lot of them, the metaphor is coming to fill in for the just growing sense of instability in the space, and then which is actually kind of counterintuitively a logic that administrators are using for increased investment and renewed projects to pinpoint exactly where poisons might be coming from and exactly spread colonial infrastructure via settlements, via plantations, via canal digging, a lot of different methods into these areas of fragility or instability. And then when there are specific moments of insurrection or violence, that's when the materiality of the poison, or at least the suspicion, I should say, of violence, that's when the materiality of poison becomes really a razor sharp focus. And this is, so that's that. I got a little bit off topic there, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about this.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Thank you. Sorry for interrupting, because I'll lose my thought. So are you suggesting, and it's a very novel and interesting suggestion, that the physical or environmental fragility is linked to the bodily fragility or the distrust? The distrust of the land is also the distrust of the indigenous people. Is that the link you are creating?
Yes, that is probably better terminology than around it. So yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to. Really, the project emerges out of trying to understand why there's just this shift in language about how the climate works and how the broader landscape is. At one point, it's really healthy for humans to live there, and then it's really dangerous, and then it keeps flipping around. Like, what is happening here? So I think my provisional answer to this is that it's about this, exactly, this increasingly apparent sense of bodily fragility vis-a-vis indigenous and maroon power. Precisely. If that, hopefully that answers your follow-up. Thinking about kind of the 2 questions about maroon ecologies, maroon knowledge. I think that is, yeah. So I'm thinking about maroon ecologies as a new way of trying to think, new way for me. I'm not saying I'm the first person to do it, but a new way of trying to frame the Caribbean instead of the European cartographic sense that shows that France controls this island and Britain controls this island, when really there are 400 white inhabitants in Guyana. Like that is not, and Guiana's huge. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of maroon and indigenous people there. Like that is not control of a place from the French perspective. So I'm trying to think about exactly how, specifically something like a river can convey a much different sense of resistance, of control, of what inhabitants of these spaces specifically means. And I'm doing that I'm a historian of science. So I'm doing that from the scientific programs that French Restoration and Ancien Regime figures are trying to launch in to control these zones that they already say that they are controlling them. So why are they going back in and trying to in the 1770s and 80s, there's a huge project to cordon off the entire coastline of eastern Guyana from essentially the island of Cayenne, which is pretty much smack dab in the middle of the colony, all the way to the coast of Maripa, modern day Maripa in Brazil, by making this vast set of canals and literal palisades, trying to just create literally like a ring wall around the colony so that they can control this area and then maybe push in later on, deforest these areas to try to provide lumber to the other colonies that are dealing with huge climatic instability from deforestation, all of these things. So I hope that answers some of the question about how I'm thinking about the river and how maroon constant mobility around the island is really thwarting any colonial attempt to increase the French presence, to increase their ability to, a lot of the language that you see around this is like, recoup the investment that we have lost or that has been languishing here for so long, find the potential that has been sitting here latently. That's a lot of the language. So yeah, the river is really, and specifically mangroves actually are really the two axes along which a lot of this struggle I'm seeing actually unfold. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We should open up to a general discussion, but I mean, this has been so rich and amazing that I can't resist the temptation to abuse my role as a chair and add a couple of comments myself. So I really liked your provocation, Pratik, about the limits of history of science. That's quite well taken. And it is perhaps also due in, I don't really know whether they are limits or a little bit of obstacles, but partly I think these limits are due by our tendency as historians to identify one thing. Still, after all those years of social and cultural deconstruction, one thing as science. For the when it comes to botany in the 18th and 19th, early 19th century, it's Linnaean nomenclature and taxonomy that is the science. But in fact, Linnaeus also creates another set of conceptual tools, the economy of nature, thinking about the economy of nature. And he contributes a lot to that. It's a constant preoccupation of 18th and early 19th century naturalists. And it deals precisely in the complexities of what we nowadays would call ecological relationships. And the same thing, this builds on things that Pablo and Emily said. In the same way, of course, the colonies were not just plantations. Yeah? There is this additional economy, subsistence economy that enslaved people and people who escaped slavery had to establish. Because slaves, as far as I understand it, I'm not a historian of slavery, had to feed themselves. They weren't fed. So they had to find niches between the plantations to set up their own economy. And that's being observed by naturalists, European naturalists. They learn about this. Yeah? So I'm pretty sure that Linnaeus learns about the economy of nature through his trip to Lapland and studying Sami reindeer husbandry. That's where he gets his central ideas from that inform his concept of an economy of nature. And it's sort of these And what's interesting about it is that the economy of nature has the tendency to upset categories, like what is a poison, what is useful, this very interesting category of obstructions. Yeah. That's really interesting, and I'm very curious what will come out of the study of the Deluge manuscripts of Anderson in this respect.